Johnny Rotten, the notorious frontman of the Sex Pistols, once gave a BBC radio interview in 1978 that remained hidden from public earshot until it unexpectedly surfaced years later. Recorded during the height of the punk rock movement, this interview captured Rotten in a candid moment, discussing a radical and provocative film concept targeting controversial celebrities. The conversation, initially too bold for broadcast, found its way onto a compilation album, igniting widespread interest only decades after its recording. This revelation not only sheds light on Rotten's audacious thoughts, but also highlights a forgotten piece of punk rock history, revealing the depth of Rotten's critique against the celebrity culture of his time. During the interview, Rotten expressed his desire to confront Jimmy Savile, a figure he labeled a hypocrite involved in dubious activities. His comments were straightforward and unfiltered, suggesting Savile was engaged in actions many found objectionable, yet were often whispered about rather than discussed openly. Rotten highlighted the disparity between Savile's public persona and his private deeds, which he believed were shielded by his celebrity status. The interview delved deeper as Rotten named other celebrities he believed were equally culpable of various misdeeds, underscoring his intent to expose these through his proposed film project. His candidness and the nature of the allegations made this conversation particularly striking, especially considering it occurred during an era when such discussions about public figures were typically avoided in the mainstream media. Rotten's critique wasn't just aimed at individuals, but was a broader condemnation of a culture that, according to him, allowed known wrongdoers to thrive unchecked. He lamented the fact that while these behaviors were an open secret among insiders and the public, there was a collective failure to address them adequately. This systemic issue, as Rotten pointed out, enabled figures like Savile to maintain their public facades while exploiting their positions. As the interview progressed, Rotten revealed that his forthright statements led to his being unofficially banned from BBC Radio, a sanction that underscored the contentious nature of his remarks. He argued that his attempt to call out what he saw as hypocrisy and moral decay was met not with support, but with censorship, reflecting a media landscape unwilling or unable to tackle such sensitive issues head-on. The discussion then turned to the implications of this silence and inaction. Rotten voiced a profound bitterness toward the entertainment industry and the regulatory bodies that, in his view, failed to protect the vulnerable or hold the powerful accountable. He stressed that the reluctance to confront these issues was not just a failure of the individuals involved, but also of the institutions that had the authority to intervene but chose not to. Reflecting on the broader impact of his banned interview, Rotten emphasized how the suppression of his critical voice perhaps allowed predatory behaviors to persist. The conversation underscored a missed opportunity for earlier intervention, which might have prevented further harm. Rotten expressed a grim satisfaction in finally having his warnings, once ignored or suppressed, come to light, suggesting a vindication of his long-held positions. As the interview concluded, the present-day context was brought to the forefront, with the BBC expressing its dismay over the now public crimes and initiating a review of its past practices. This late acknowledgement by the BBC served as a somber reminder of the enduring consequences of ignoring or suppressing critical voices like Rotten's. The Sex Pistols are often hailed as the trailblazers of the punk movement in the UK, yet digging a little deeper reveals a surprising twist. While they appeared to be revolutionaries, it turns out they were deeply entangled with the very system they claimed to oppose. This realization emerges as one learns they were one of the first examples of what's called an industry plant. Explaining the concept of an industry plant could evoke a range of descriptions, yet it essentially focuses on two things: authenticity and misdirection. Similar to how espionage organizations might embed spies within enemy lines, An industry plant in the music industry refers to an artist who is secretly backed by major labels or promoters to craft and push a particular image or sound. This is particularly significant in genres like hip-hop and punk rock, where the authenticity of the music and artist is paramount. The punk rock genre first ignited in New York in the mid-70s with bands like the Stooges and the New York Dolls, who introduced a more chaotic and aggressive form of rock music. This new sound was honed and adopted by subsequent bands who played at a famed New York music venue called CBGB, where bands like the Ramones, Television, and Blondie developed a new musical aesthetic and philosophy. Among those drawn to the CBGB scene was an Englishman named Malcolm McLaren, who managed the New York Dolls and was exploring new acts. He was particularly struck by Richard Hell, the bass player of Television, whose style of torn and ripped T-shirts coupled with spiky hair deeply influenced him. McLaren saw this look as something he could adapt and market, aiming to transform it into something uniquely British. Back in the UK, punk was also gaining traction. McLaren decided to leverage this growing trend by rebranding his London clothing boutique, initially named Let It Rock, and then renamed Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, to simply Sex, aligning the store more with the burgeoning punk scene. He co-ran this boutique with fashion designer Vivienne Westwood. Beyond just selling clothes, McLaren returned to managing music, adopting a more calculated approach. He envisioned creating a band that would not only produce music, but also serve as live mannequins to promote his store's clothing, thus drawing in customers. This led to the formation of the Sex Pistols, with Johnny Rotten auditioned right in the shop. McLaren was candid about his priorities. For him, fashion drove the music, claiming punk was the sound of that fashion. So, unlike typical industry plants managed by record labels, the Sex Pistols were orchestrated by a clothing store. The initial lineup included members from a band called The Strand. They auditioned for a singer, eventually choosing John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, more for his punk demeanor than his singing ability. Lydon later criticized McLaren and Westwood for exploiting the punk movement for personal gain, labeling them more as opportunists than true punks. The Sex Pistols quickly became notorious, both for their music and their antics off stage. Their first single, Anarchy in the UK, was a bold proclamation of rebellion and disorder, capturing the essence of the punk spirit. Yet, despite the song's raw energy, the recording process was dominated by McLaren's insistence on a certain sound, often at the expense of musical quality. McLaren's connections in the music industry allowed the Sex Pistols to sign with EMI after just a few performances, a typical move for an industry plant, where connections rather than talent or fan base often open doors. However, their controversial behavior soon led to EMI dropping them before their first album was even released. As the band evolved, it became clear that the music was secondary to the image and the controversy. This was exemplified when Glenn Matlock, the band's most skilled musician, was replaced by Sid Vicious, who epitomized the punk look but lacked musical ability. This change marked a shift towards prioritizing spectacle over substance, a direction that McLaren embraced. Despite being dropped by multiple record labels, the Sex Pistols eventually signed with Virgin Records. This turbulent journey through the music industry highlighted not only the contrived nature of their emergence, but also the complex interplay between authenticity and commercialism in the punk rock movement. The Sex Pistols began recording their debut album, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, a project that would unexpectedly become a defining piece of punk history. As they laid down the tracks, Sid Vicious, the band's bassist, known more for his image than his musicianship, was hospitalized with hepatitis, leaving a significant gap in the band's lineup. Guitarist Steve Jones stepped in to cover the bass parts. Jones reminisced about the experience, noting the challenge of covering for Sid, who struggled with the basics of the instrument, often confusing guitar techniques with bass playing. Despite these setbacks, the album captured an extraordinary energy that resonated with the disaffected youth of the era. It was raw and unpolished, yet it struck a chord with listeners. Noel Gallagher of Oasis later described the album as possibly the greatest album of all time for its impact on music and culture, emphasizing how it laid the groundwork for modern guitar music. One of the album's standout tracks, God Save the Queen, was a controversial anthem that challenged the reverence for British national symbols. The song debuted strongly in music charts, but was rumored to have been manipulated to prevent it from reaching the top spot, a claim that added to the band's rebellious mystique. In response, the band's manager, Malcolm McLaren, and their label, Virgin Records, orchestrated a bold publicity stunt by having the Sex Pistols perform the song on a boat near the Houses of Parliament. The band's influence was often compared to that of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and like those legendary bands, the Sex Pistols aimed to conquer America. However, their entry into the U.S. was fraught with difficulties, including a $1 million bond posted by their label to secure visas. Opting for a less predictable route, they toured southern cities instead of starting in New York, the birthplace of punk. Johnny Rotten explained this decision by saying they chose cities where people would either embrace or despise them, avoiding the pretentiousness of New York. Their U.S. tour was a mix of skepticism and fascination from audiences. Sid Vicious's worsening heroin addiction took a toll, culminating in a failed suicide attempt in Atlanta. His unpredictable behavior on stage, including using slurs against the audience, sparked both outrage and intense media attention. The tour's chaotic nature was epitomized at a gig in San Antonio, described by attendee Jesse Sublett as instant mayhem, with the band barely holding together through technical difficulties and Sid's poor musicianship. As the tour moved west, the band faced continued challenges, culminating in a disorganized final show in San Francisco. Steve Jones recalled the difficulties of performing with a sick Sid Vicious, who often wasn't even properly connected to the amplifiers. After this disastrous conclusion, Johnny Rotten famously asked the audience, "Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?" signaling the end of the tour and the band's imminent dissolution. Following the tumultuous tour, the band returned to the UK, and Sid Vicious rekindled his troubled relationship with Nancy Spungen. They were often in the tabloids for their volatile relationship, culminating in tragedy when Nancy was found dead from stab wounds in a New York hotel, with Sid charged with her murder. His own life ended shortly after, with a heroin overdose, before he could stand trial. The fallout from the band's breakup and the subsequent controversies left a lasting impact on the music industry. While other members went on to have successful careers in different bands, they never replicated the explosive impact of the Sex Pistols. The band's legacy remains polarized. Some view them as the quintessential punk band that changed music forever, while others see them as the prototype for the manufactured bands that would follow, marking the Sex Pistols as Britain's first boy band in a way that presaged the future of the music industry. In 1980, John Lennon, who was primarily immersed in classical music at the time, found himself witnessing the punk scene unfolding in New York City via cable TV. This was during an era when iconic acts like Blondie and Sid Vicious were making their marks, trying to succeed in the bustling environment of the Big Apple, as it was famously called. From his vantage point, Lennon had the opportunity to see these performers live out their lives and careers on the small screen, which brought the vibrant and chaotic punk scene directly into his living room. Sid Vicious, in particular, was often seen in his everyday life. His movements and actions captured in documentaries and various video clips that showcased him living in a hotel and engaging in the raw, unfiltered lifestyle that punk epitomized. Lennon saw not just Vicious, but also performances and snippets from other Sex Pistols members, including Johnny Rotten. These clips, showing the band playing in venues like Max's Kansas City, reminded Lennon of his own early days with the Beatles, especially their time in Hamburg. Lennon recalled how the Beatles used to behave before they were polished for mainstream success. He reminisced about sleeping, eating, and even swearing on stage actions that were all part of their natural, unscripted performances back then. He saw a reflection of his past in the punk ethos of the Sex Pistols, who seemed to embody that same unapologetic raw spirit without the need for the industry gloss that was often required to secure record deals at the time. Despite the challenges the Sex Pistols faced in gaining acceptance and securing record contracts, Lennon expressed a genuine appreciation for their authenticity and the vibrancy they brought to the music scene. He admired their ability to be true to themselves, reflecting a sentiment that the true spirit of rock and roll still lived on in these new artists. While in Bermuda, Lennon's exposure to new music continued when Fred Seaman, an employee of his, introduced him to the B-52s and other contemporary bands like Madness and the Pretenders. Initially, Lennon had shown little interest in these newer acts, focusing instead on reggae and other genres he was more passionate about. He had previously dismissed the tapes Seaman made for him, which included a mix of reggae and tracks from these bands, without giving them much attention. However, his time in Bermuda ignited a curiosity to reconnect with the evolving music scene. Lennon asked Seaman to reintroduce him to the music he had overlooked. Upon listening to these bands again, Lennon found himself impressed and invigorated by the creativity and energy of these groups, acknowledging that he had missed out by not paying attention earlier. In the late 1970s, the rise of punk rock shook the music scene, casting the traditional rock bands of the era in a somewhat outdated light. This was the context in which two of music's most colorful personalities, Freddie Mercury of Queen and Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols, found themselves in a memorable encounter that highlighted the clash between different musical ideologies and personal styles. Queen, led by the charismatic Freddie Mercury, was a band known for its theatrical style and complex productions. Mercury himself was not just a singer but a showman, aiming to combine the grandeur of opera and ballet with rock music, making it accessible and appealing to a broad audience. His mission was clear. He wanted to elevate the experience of rock music to something more sophisticated and refined, which he famously once described as bringing ballet to the masses. On the other side of the music spectrum was Sid Vicious, the bassist of the Sex Pistols, who embodied the raw, chaotic spirit of punk rock. The punk movement was marked by its rebellious attitude, often expressing disdain for the perceived pretentiousness of the music industry and its stars. The Sex Pistols, with their aggressive sound and confrontational style, stood in stark contrast to the polished performances of bands like Queen. The two worlds collided at Wessex Studios in London, where both Queen and the Sex Pistols were recording at the same time. It was here that Freddie Mercury and Sid Vicious had their infamous interaction. As the story goes, Queen was in the control room, with Freddie at the mixing desk, when Sid Vicious, somewhat worse for wear, barged in. In a mocking tone, Vicious called out to Mercury, questioning if he had succeeded in his goal of bringing ballet to the masses. The comment was dripping with sarcasm, as Vicious saw Mercury's theatrical aspirations as antithetical to the punk ethos of simplicity and directness. Freddie Mercury, never one to shy away from a challenge, responded with equal parts wit and disdain. He mockingly addressed Sid as Simon Ferocious, or something similar, playing on Sid's stage name in a way that clearly got under the punk rocker's skin. The situation escalated quickly, with Mercury confronting Sid physically, grabbing him by the lapels and pushing him towards the door. This encounter was not just a personal confrontation, but a symbolic clash between the extravagant artistry of Queen and the raw, stripped-down aggression of the Sex Pistols. Despite the tension, both parties walked away from the incident relatively unscathed, with Mercury later reflecting on it as a moment where they survived that test, of facing off against the anarchic force of punk embodied by Sid Vicious. The encounter became a legendary anecdote in the history of rock music, often cited as an example of the cultural and aesthetic conflicts that defined the music scene of that era.